C, and D, I go, man, thank goodness I'm not like that Larry Wells guy. But you know what I'm saying. If you talk to anybody, yeah, it's. I've been in churches a long time, and generally, the people who are the most adamant about a particular sin are the ones with the biggest skeletons in the closet. Because I'm trying to point at you so you won't look in here. Don't look behind the curtain, right? And that's what you'll find inevitably. That we all have something that we're not proud of because we're all sinful creatures. And so don't hear me blasting anybody. We are all sinful creatures. But we usually like to point at the sins that we don't struggle with. That's why we shouldn't judge. And we want to define what is good not on the basis of what God says, but on our own wisdom or our own experience or our own knowledge. So the first time the word kata appears in the Bible is not at the tree. It's not Adam and Eve. Anybody want to take a guess? Cain and Abel. You win the second prize. I don't have any prizes. So, but the first time sin, kata, appears in the Bible is Cain and Abel. And so, you know the story. Cain's jealous of his brother because God seems to favor him more. And in Genesis chapter 4, verse 6 and 7, God is speaking to Cain and says, be careful. If you don't choose what is good, kata is crouching at the door. It wants you, but you can rule over it. Failure or missing the mark is personified in that, right? It's made a entity. Kata is crouching at your door. It wants you. The point that is made is our tendency for self-deception runs deep. And it's rooted in our own desires. It's rooted in our own urges that compel us to act at my benefit to the expense of others. And so we get back to that fundamental breakdown, right? God and others. And so that leads to a chain of relational breakdowns. You start talking about sins and no, you look at the sins and you're like, okay, what is lying? You know? And we go, well, there's little white lies. And I don't always, and so what is a little lie? Sometimes it's necessary to lie. But when we start following that out and you see the effect that lies have on your relationships, the ripples of that keep going, right? And so then trust breaks down, and then your relationships break down, and before you know it, you're in a place. It's that same process, right? We're back to James again. Or pick any sin. I don't care what it is. But you'll generally see that part of the problem is that thing, whatever it is, it affects not only me, but it affects everyone around me. And it goes out, and sometimes I don't even realize how far the ripples are going to go with that my thing that I think, oh, what's it going to hurt? It's just, what's this going to hurt? Or this is a victimless crime. You'll hear people say that. Well, this is not really, this is a victimless thing. There's no such thing. It keeps going. And we're not going to go down that trail. But it's why in the New Testament, Paul describes hamartia as a force, as a power that rules over us. He's even going to say in Romans that we are slaves. We are enslaved by missing the mark. Now you start thinking about that. If you're that's how that would have read to people who read it in the original language. Paul would have said, we are enslaved by missing the mark. He's even going to go so far as to say that it lives within us. That this failure is embedded so deep that I want to do the things that I know are right, but I end up continually doing the things that I don't want to do. And so biblically, this word sin, whether it's Old Testament or New Testament, kata or hamartia, is an indictment of our human condition, right? It's about our failure. That no matter how hard we try, we can't get it right. Paul is saying, the things I want to do, I don't do, and the things I don't want to do are what I end up doing. That's pretty much human nature in a nutshell, right? No matter how hard I try, I keep trying, and I keep trying, and I keep trying, and I just keep failing. And it's not only our failure to be good, it's our failure to even be obedient. Because no matter how hard we try, we continually fail at that relationship, at loving God and loving others. Which one? Oh, Romans 7. Yes, sir. It's these deep selfish impulses, right? It's I want what's best for me, and it doesn't matter if it hurts you. It doesn't matter if it violates something that changes my relationship with God. It's about me. And so this brings us to a place where we start to see that this missing the mark, this kata, this hamartia, has fundamentally created a rift, because God's holiness, and we'll come back and do that word at some point too, but God's holiness makes it where this can't be in His presence. And you'll hear people talk about that, and it's almost like, God's portrayed as this germaphobe, and He doesn't want anybody to come near Him or He'll zap you. That's not it's more like God is the sun, and you can't land a rocket ship on the sun, because it just don't work. And that's what sin cannot come into His presence, because it will burn up. It just can't exist there. It's not going to happen. And no matter how hard you try, and no matter how hard you justify, when that comes into contact with the holiness of God, it can't exist there. And so it creates this fundamental separation. Somebody said earlier, Norma, it's fundamental separation that keeps us from that relationship. Pat.
That's why the scripture in 2 Corinthians said, God made him with no sin to be sin for us, so that we might become the righteousness of God.
She said, for those of you who can't hear, that's why Scripture says that God made Him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. And that's the good news. That's why we get to the gospel, and the gospel writers say this is good news. Because our inability to miss the mark, and what was the mark? Being the fully human person that God created us to be, that fully honors Him and that fully honors others, being that person. That's our mark right there. And our inability to miss the mark has left us separated from God until Jesus, whose human existence was the perfectly lived out human existence that we cannot attain. He lived out. He hit the mark. He hit the mark for us because we're unable to hit the mark. Does that make sense? And so, 1 Peter, He committed no sin, but He carried our sins in His body on the cross, right? That He took full responsibility for each of us individually and humanity corporately, as He took responsibility for our failure, for our inability to hit the mark, and He took on all that failure and died for that failure, and then was raised from the dead to offer His life as a covering for mine. And that's the good news. If you talk to anybody, Christian, non-Christian, and you ask them about the human condition, doesn't matter whether they're a believer or not, everybody's going to tell you that humanity's messed up. Anybody. But because you look around, you watch the news, you look at social media, you can't miss the fact that we're messed up, that there's something wrong, right? That we're somehow not right. You talk to people and they'll say, well, I don't believe in God and I don't follow any of those rules. Well, that's fine, but then you're out here marching for whatever cause it is you're marching for. Why are you marching? Because if there's no God, there's no right or wrong. There's no justice. There's no any of these things that people are holding on to. It doesn't exist. It's just free-for-all. It's survival of the fittest. There's got to be something, because we have this innate nature that tells us that's not right. Whatever it is, we could tell story after story after story, and whether you're a Christian or not, sooner or later we'll come across a story and you'll go, well, that's just not right. That shouldn't happen. And it doesn't matter what the particular sin is. There's some point where we'll realize that misses the mark. And then you ask the question, so where do you get that mark from? Because that mark had to come from somewhere. And most people would admit that humanity is far from perfect. And the Bible is going to say a lot about this. It's going to use these words like transgression. Transgression, you're going to get bonus right here. We'll do extra words. Is in Hebrew pasha. Transgression is literally rebellion. In some of your older translations, they'll translate it trespass, right? And so it's failing to follow a direction, or failing to to be obedient. It's generally, if you look at it outside of the Bible and the religious connotation, it's generally used to describe the betrayal of a relationship. We're coming back to that mark again, right? That transgression usually means betrayal. In 2 Kings, for example, there's a king who dies, and it says the nation of Moab pashad Israel, transgressed against Israel. Now, that in a lot of our translations will be translated rebelled, but it's about breaking the trust of the treaty, right? It's Moab had a treaty with Israel, and when this king died, they broke that treaty. They rebelled. They violated. They trespassed. That's the fundamental. It's breaking trust with someone. In biblical Hebrew, you don't pesha against someone. You pesha with someone. So I don't pesha against Doug, but I can pesha with Doug. I can break Doug's trust. I can't do that to him. Does that make sense? It's about breakdown in relationship. One of the Old Testament laws about theft, if an Israelite was away on a trip and somebody broke in and stole something, it's theft. But if it is a neighbor, it is pesha. It's transgression. Why? Because there's a relationship there. I don't expect that my neighbor is going to. If somebody off the street breaks in and steals something while I'm gone, then that's theft. But if Joe knows that I'm out of town and he goes to start rummaging through my house, then it's a betrayal because Joe is my neighbor. You with me? And so pesha is about breaking a relationship. And again, we see that the sin is always rooted in relationship. It's rooted in because we can pesha with God. We can break our covenant with God. We can pesha with one another. We can break our covenant with one another. God sends prophets and he proclaims to Israel, hey, you guys were supposed to be my witness. We talked about that last week, right? You were supposed to be my witness, but you have broken that trust. Micah 3:8, he says, I'm filled with the power of God to proclaim to Jacob his pesha, his transgression, his rebellion, his betrayal. Paul's going to use this idea, and he's going to use a different Greek word that you really don't care about, but it's the same principle. It's the same translation, that it's a betrayal. It's a transgression. That he's going to say that when humanity broke trust with God, they succumbed to temptation, and how that led to sin. But Paul in Romans 5 is going to say if death came to all by the transgression of a human, that word there is that betrayal, that breaking of the trust. And so he's directly connecting sin to this idea of breaking trust. And so Jesus comes because he is that fully human. He's the one who never betrays, who never breaks the trust, who never fails to hit that mark. Yet he is counted as our trespass, as our pesha, as our transgression. Isaiah calls him the servant, right? The suffering servant. We started talking about that last week, that he predicts that this person will commit no violence. He will have no treachery in him, yet he will be made to suffer. And Isaiah 53:12, on behalf of all people who pesha, that all people who break trust. And so the fundamental basis of sin is that there's this mark that involves our relationships with God, our relationships with one another. And when we miss that mark, it's called sin. And one of the ways we miss that mark is by breaking the covenant, by rebelling, by trespassing, by betraying. The other one is iniquity, and I don't know that we have time for iniquity, so we may have to stop right there. But I was going to try to give you the 3-in-1 shot today, but unfortunately we can't. I'll give you this just for fun, because I grew up and my mom always had this catalog in the house. And Avon is the Hebrew word that is translated iniquity. Now, I'm sure they didn't know that when they were naming the company. Maybe they did. Maybe they're trying to tell us something we didn't know it. But Psalm 38:6 talks about a man whose back is Avon. And it's talking about he's bent. Okay? So iniquity makes it implies bent or bent out of shape or twisted. Job 33:27 talks about a man who morally fails. This is someone who avas, that's a form of avon, what is right. It's twisted. Something is twisted up. And you'll see that the biblical phrase to bear your iniquity literally means to carry your avon. And God's punishment is usually not God smiting people, but it's God allowing the natural consequences of whatever that is that you did to be visited upon you. And so when the Bible talks about bearing your iniquity or carrying your avon, it's saying God let what was going to happen to you happen. Because you shouldn't have done, we call it, in parenting, we call it natural consequences, right? We were on vacation with my nephews once, and they're stubborn little boys. I don't know where they get that from. It must be from the cousin side of the family. But I love you, Esther. But anyway, we're walking across, and one of them doesn't want to put his shoes on. And he and his daddy lock horns. And they fight, and they argue, and they gripe, and they fight, and they argue. And finally, his daddy ends up spanking him and forcibly putting the shoes on him and getting him back to the room. Well, the next day, Daddy doesn't come with us, and we come walking back to the hotel room, and he's got his shoes on. And he looks at me, and he goes, "What did you do? How did you do that?" And I said, "I let him walk his bare feet on the hot concrete." "Sure, you don't want to put your shoes on? Let's go." He took about 5 steps, started asking for them shoes. Natural consequences. Bearing your Avon. That's what God says this is. That when we transgress, when we pasha, when we sin, when we miss the mark, when God allows the consequences of that to be visited upon us, that's bearing my iniquity. And so now, think about that carried forward in terms of Jesus. We're wrapping up because I'm summarizing real quick. Jesus, when it talks about him bearing our iniquity, man, that's not only good news, it's humbling. That he took the consequences for things that I did that I deserve. I deserve to have those consequences visited upon me. So we're going to stop because I got to, and I think Melissa is very kindly giving me that cue with that nice slide right there. Oh, we got the other one working. Cool. Oh, you're testing it. You're not giving me a cue. Well, they want to go anyway. Some of them need to use the restroom before we start. And hey, I appreciate y'all. I'm sorry this is not a good conducive environment for class, but I appreciate you guys and your chiming in. If somebody will help me pick up the arrows, or we're going to have kids shooting those at me during church. And it might make it more interesting. Hey, thanks. Have a blessed morning. We'll be back in here in 15 minutes, and